There is a particular quality to November light in Devon. It arrives late and leaves early, like a guest who never quite settles in. It falls grey and diffuse over the fields, turning the hedgerows into dark smudges against the pale sky, flattening colors, blurring edges. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the day is already pulling itself shut. The fields go amber, then brown, then something closer to nothing. And the lanes, the narrow, rural lanes that cut between estates and countryside like old scars, they go dark first. They always go dark first. In November 1997, Exwick was the kind of place people meant when they said Devon was safe. It sits on the western edge of Exeter, where the city quietly gives up trying to be a city and becomes something gentler, a suburb that leans into the fields rather than away from them. The houses there were not grand. They were the kind of houses where people kept dogs, grew vegetables in small back gardens, waved to neighbors from driveways. Children walked to school. People knew each other's names. It was, by every measure anyone would have applied at the time, an ordinary and decent place to grow up. The Bushell family lived on Burrator Drive. Number 59. Jerry and Suzanne had raised their 2 children there, Tim, the older one, nearly 16, and Kate, 14, the kind of daughter that neighbors would later describe in the exact same way, over and over, because some people are genuinely as good as they seem. Responsible. Considerate. A good student. Someone you could trust with something small and important, like a dog that belonged to someone else. Kate had long blonde hair and a sense of ordinary purpose that teenagers sometimes carry without knowing it. She did her homework. She liked music. She had plans for her brother's birthday. She'd bought him a Simpsons comic that morning, and she'd been thinking about it, that small square of paper wrapped in intention, sitting somewhere in the house while she was out. She attended St. Thomas High School, which the locals still called that even as it was renamed West Exe. She was not remarkable in the way that tragedy later demands people be remarkable. She was remarkable in the way that most 14-year-olds are remarkable if you pay attention, quietly building a life, slowly becoming a person, moving through Saturday afternoons with the easy confidence of someone who has not yet learned that the world requires more care than it appears to. Before we start, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. That Saturday, the 15th of November, 1997, had been, by all accounts, a good day. Kate had had a lie-in. School was done for the week, and the relief of that, the small exhale of a Saturday morning, had let her sleep longer than usual. When she finally got up, she and her mother Suzanne made plans to go into Exeter city centre. There was homework to finish, a project that needed library research, and birthdays to prepare for, and maybe something nice to do with the afternoon before it got dark. They drove in. The weather had been reasonable that weekend, cold, as November always is, but not savage. Not yet the grey wall of rain that would arrive the following day and make the whole landscape feel like a held breath. They went to the library first. Kate found what she needed for her school project, taking notes in the particular quiet of a Saturday library, that cathedral hush of weekend learning. Then they went shopping. They went to the Virgin Megastore, because there was a CD Kate wanted, something by one of her favorite bands, the kind of music that matters intensely at 14 and fades gently by 20. She found it. She bought it. Then, while they were out, she bought the Simpsons comic for Tim. His birthday was coming soon, and she'd been thinking about what to get him. It was a small, considered gift. The kind that takes someone else into account. It would sit in the house, never given. They drove home in the early afternoon. The light was already starting to thin. Back in her room, Kate finished her homework. This detail, that she finished it, sits in the record of that day with a particular weight. She didn't put it off. She didn't leave it for Sunday evening. She sat down and worked through it, the way she always did, because she was the kind of person who finished things. The neighbors, Stuart and Allison Smith, were away for the weekend. This happened from time to time. They'd ask Kate if she'd walk their Jack Russell, Gemma. Kate had always said yes. She loved dogs, even though the Bushells didn't have one of their own. Walking Gemma was something she genuinely looked forward to, 20 minutes of fresh air, a small animal with specific and urgent opinions about which direction to go, the lane that she knew so well she could have walked it in her sleep. It was familiar. It was safe. It was, in the way that things are safe when nothing has ever happened on them, completely unremarkable. At 4:30 in the afternoon, she told her parents she was going. She said she'd be 20 minutes. Maybe a little more. The lane was just down the road. Jerry and Suzanne said fine. Because why wouldn't they? She'd walked that route before. She knew the area. It was 20 minutes, and then she'd be back, and they'd have the evening ahead of them. She went next door. She collected Gemma. The Jack Russell would have been pleased to see her. Dogs have no use for formality. They are simply and entirely happy when the person who walks them arrives. The lead would have jingled. Gemma would have turned in a small ecstatic circle. And then they headed out together into the November afternoon. This is the last time she was seen by anyone who knew her. The route Kate took from Burrator Drive is not complicated. She walked along the road, turning toward Exwick Lane, the narrow rural cut-through that locals used as a path into the fields, toward Natterwater and Whitestone. She would have passed the primary school, Exwick Heights, the building quiet and locked on a Saturday. Then down into the lane itself, where the road narrowed and the hedgerows rose on either side, and the light, already retreating, became something closer to dusk even at this early hour. It is important to understand Exwick Lane. Not as a crime scene, not yet, but as a place that people used every day without a second thought. It was a dog-walking route. Perhaps 100 people walked it daily, in the mornings and in the late afternoons, the dual rhythms of dog ownership. It was a cut-through for those who knew the area, not a road you'd find without knowing it was there, not a lane that appeared on tourist maps or drew strangers in for scenic reasons. It was a local lane. Used by local people. It required a specific kind of familiarity. The hedgerows in November have no leaves. They are bare architecture, the skeleton of what the lane looks like in summer, when the green closes everything off and you could walk 20 feet down it without seeing more than a few yards ahead. In November, you can see through them. The fields open up. The sky gets wider. But the light is still bad, because November makes everything feel like late evening no matter what time it actually is. Kate and Gemma walked down the lane. The dog would have been pulling toward interesting smells, toward the particular democracy of field edges where every passing animal has left a message. Kate would have been doing what you do when you walk a dog, holding the lead, letting her mind run a little loose, thinking about nothing in particular. At 4:55, a father and his children who were also out walking passed Kate in the lane. They saw her heading up Exwick Lane with Gemma. She was fine. She was just walking a dog on a Saturday afternoon. Moments later, 5 o'clock, perhaps, a mother and daughter driving down the lane toward Exwick passed her. They would later say that Kate had looked directly at them as they drove by. They remembered it because it seemed, in retrospect, slightly unusual. Not alarming, just a moment of eye contact that registered. A young girl with a small dog, looking straight at the people in the passing car. They continued driving. About 100 yards from where Kate was walking, there was a blue car parked in a lobby near the stables. A man was standing beside it. The two witnesses in the car noticed him, noticed the car, noticed the men, and then drove on. There was nothing about the scene that made them stop. There was nothing that made them turn around. They did not know that they had just passed Kate for the last time. And they did not know that approximately 5 minutes later, when another car came down the same lane, Kate was gone. This is what disappearance looks like in real time. It looks like nothing. It looks like a lane and a dog and a Saturday afternoon. It looks like the kind of thing that happens in other families, to other people, somewhere else. It does not look like danger. That is the whole point of it. That is how it works. Back on Burrator Drive, Jerry and Suzanne began to wait. 5 o'clock came. At first, it registered as nothing more than a slight miscalculation. 20 minutes, she'd said. Maybe a little more. But Gemma had a way of wanting to sniff everything, and sometimes the walk took longer than planned. Jerry or Suzanne might have glanced at the clock and thought, she'll be back in a minute. She's just taking a bit longer. This is the first of many moments in this story where what someone told themselves to avoid panic turned out to cost them something they couldn't get back. Not because panic would have changed anything, it almost certainly wouldn't have. But because the story of Kate Bushell is, in some ways, the story of all those ordinary human instincts that tell us everything is probably fine, and the terrible gap between probably and certainly. By 5:15, the slight miscalculation had sharpened into something more like concern. Not alarm, not yet, but a specific quality of attention. The kind where you look at the clock and then look at the window and then look at the clock again. November light was already completely gone by then. The lane would be dark. But Kate knew the lane. She'd walked it before. And maybe Gemma had found something particularly interesting near the stile. And maybe they'd gone a little further than usual. There were 100 reasonable explanations for 25 minutes becoming 40. Suzanne and Jerry told themselves those explanations. At 5:30, something else happened on Exwick Lane. A small dog, a Jack Russell, running loose, was seen coming out of a gateway at the base of a field. The gateway sat at the edge of the lane where a path led into the field. The dog was running without a lead. Nobody who saw it knew what it meant. A dog running loose on a country lane in Devon in November is not, by itself, a signal of anything. Dogs get off leads. Dogs squeeze through gates. Dogs run. The person who saw Gemma would not have connected the running dog to the missing girl, because at 5:30, nobody had yet decided the girl was missing. Nobody had started asking questions. The dog that could have told them everything had nobody to tell. Gemma ran, and the lane was quiet again. On Burrator Drive, the clock kept moving. By 6 o'clock, Suzanne and Jerry could no longer tell themselves reasonable explanations. The thing about reasonable explanations is that they have a shelf life, and after a certain number of minutes the shelf collapses under its own weight. 40 minutes becomes an hour, and an hour becomes something you have to act on. It was dark. It had been dark for a long time. Kate was 14, and she'd said 20 minutes, and there was no reasonable explanation that stretched to an hour and a half without a phone call or a note or some kind of signal that she was all right. They drove up the lane in their car. Both of them, together, the way couples move when fear becomes large enough to require witnesses. They drove slowly, looking. The headlights swept the hedgerows. The lane that Kate had walked down a little over an hour ago now looked entirely different in the dark, narrower, deeper, the fields beyond the hedges invisible. They could see very little. They called her name. Nothing came back. They drove back home and called the police. It is worth pausing here and thinking about what that phone call felt like. Not what was said, the facts of what was said are simple. My daughter went to walk a dog and she hasn't come back and it's been over an hour and a half. Those facts are easy to say. But the act of picking up the phone and making that call is the act of admitting something to yourself that you have been refusing to admit. It is the moment when probably fine becomes something else. When you stop being a parent who is waiting for a child to come home and become a parent who has reported a child missing. Jerry and Suzanne Bushell made that call while their son Tim was in the house, while Kate's birthday present for him sat unwrapped somewhere nearby, while her homework sat finished on her desk, while the CD she'd bought that morning waited for someone to play it. The police were called. And then the search began. But let's go back. Let's go back to that lane, and to the people who were in it, and to the things that were seen and the things that were not yet understood. Because the 45 minutes or so between Kate leaving the lane and her father finding her are a compressed and chaotic space, and inside that space are several people who saw things that they would spend years replaying in their minds. The mother and daughter who had driven down the lane at 5 o'clock, the ones who noticed Kate looking directly at them, they also noticed the blue car. A small blue car, parked in the lobby near the stables on the southern side of the lane, facing away from Exwick. There was a man standing beside it. He was white, somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. Average build. Average height. Clean shaven. Dark hair that came down to his collar. He was just standing there. About 15 minutes before that sighting, 2 other witnesses had driven down the same lane and seen a blue Ford Fiesta parked there, in the opposite direction. And then after the first witnesses drove past, after they'd clocked Kate and the men in the car and continued on, when another car came down the lane minutes later, Kate was gone. The blue car was still there, or had gone, and it's not entirely clear which, and that lack of clarity has haunted the investigation ever since. What is clear is that the last confirmed sighting of Kate alive was about 100 yards from that lobby. 100 yards. The man by the blue car has never come forward. Not in 1997. Not in 1998. Not in 2017, when police made their 20-year anniversary appeal. Not in 2022, when the reward reached £20,000. Not once. Despite repeated, sustained, high-profile appeals. Despite the case making front-page news nationally. Despite appearing on Crime Watch twice. The man who was standing by a blue car in a lobby on Exwick Lane on the afternoon of the 15th of November 1997, 100 yards from where Kate Bushell was found dead, has never contacted police to explain what he was doing there. Lead Detective Mike Stevens was direct about what that failure to come forward meant. He said, "Despite extensive publicity, this individual has failed to come forward and may clearly be Kate's killer." But the man by the blue car was not the only person in the lane that afternoon who never came forward. About 20 to 30 minutes after Kate was found, sometime after 7:30, when the blue lights were already gathering on Burrator Drive, when the shock was still arriving in rolling waves through the small community of Exwick, half a mile away, in the Farm Hill and Cornflower Hill area of the estate, a witness saw something that stopped them cold. A man was running. Not jogging. Not moving quickly in the way people do when they're late. Running frantically, those are the words used, over and over, in the witness accounts. Running out of control, very fast, down a muddy slippery hill, from the direction of the field where Kate had been found. He was running in a way that described panic. In a way that described someone who needed to get somewhere else very quickly and didn't care what it looked like. The police helicopter was circling above. He ran down the hill and back into the estate and was never seen again. That man has also never come forward. Not once, in nearly 30 years. Not to say I was just taking a run. Not to say I didn't know what had happened. Not to say I saw something I couldn't explain and was frightened. Nothing. 2 men, 1 lane, 1 afternoon. Both gone. And before either of them, before the afternoon of the 15th of November, there had been a third figure. Someone who had been noticed in the weeks prior to Kate's death, in the same area, by the same people who walked that lane regularly. A vagrant. A man who was seen in the fields and hedgerows around Exwick Lane on multiple occasions, always wearing the same large coat, regardless of the weather. He'd been spotted several times over several weeks. One local resident who walked his own dog along the lane regularly described the man as unsettling in a way that was hard to articulate. He was just always there, in the same heavy coat, in a place that didn't require him to be. On the evening of Wednesday the 12th of November, 3 days before Kate was killed, this same resident was walking his dog down the lane when the vagrant suddenly came out from behind the trees and startled him. Came out from behind the trees. Not from a path, not from a visible direction. From behind the trees, unexpectedly, in the dark. And on the weekend before the murder, someone noticed an orange or red tent pitched near the spot where Kate would later be found dead. There was nothing technically wrong with camping in the fields around Exeter. But camping alone in a field in mid-November, outside a city, with no apparent reason to be there, that had registered as unusual to the neighbors who noticed it. It had been unusual enough to remember. It would become far more significant than anyone could have imagined at the time. 3 suspicious figures seen in the area. 3 men who were never found, never identified, never explained. And somewhere among them, or separate from all of them entirely, a killer who had brought a knife. Let's talk about what was found. Not the body, not yet. That moment belongs to Jerry Bushell, and it will come, and when it comes it will carry the full weight it deserves. Before that, let's talk about what the killer left behind, because in a case that has yielded almost no answers, the physical evidence that was found in those fields tells a partial story, one that begins to sketch the outline of a person, without ever fully resolving into a face. The most significant piece of physical evidence found at the scene was also, ultimately, the most frustrating. More than 100 orange fibers were found on Kate Bushell's body. 1 more was found on a nearby country stile, the stile that anyone would have had to cross to reach the field where she was found. These were not fibers from Kate's clothing. Police were clear about that. The orange fibers were completely alien to Kate and to her home. They had been left by someone else. Someone who had been in very close contact with Kate in that field, close enough for more than 100 tiny threads to transfer from their clothing to her body. The forensic detail is stark. You do not leave 100 fibers on someone from a distance. The fibers were bright orange, a shade described specifically as azoic dyed cotton, the kind of dye used predominantly in non-fluorescent workwear. Boiler suits. Aprons. Work gloves. The kind of clothing worn in manual labor, by builders, farm workers, landscapers, mechanics, slaughterhouse workers. Not the kind of clothing you'd wear casually on a Saturday afternoon walk. Not the kind of clothing that ends up on you by accident. Police said something telling about these fibers, that the person who killed Kate may not necessarily have been wearing the clothing the fibers came from at the time of the murder. The fibers could have come from an item they'd carried, a coat, a bag, something stored in their vehicle. This was a significant caveat, and one that opened a larger question: who keeps orange workwear in their car? Who is the kind of person for whom a boiler suit or a work apron is simply always present, part of the background of their daily life? Someone who works with their hands. Someone with a van, or a truck, or a work vehicle. Someone local enough to know that Exwick Lane exists, and to know which gate leads into which field, and to understand exactly how isolated that particular stretch of land is on a Saturday afternoon in November. The knife was never found. Police described the wound to Kate's throat in terms that are clinical but devastating, a catastrophic injury caused by a single, ferocious movement. The blade entered from the side of her neck. It was at least 6 inches long. The pathologist's assessment was, according to police, that the perpetrator may have had prior experience of slaughtering animals, specifically sheep. The action required to kill in that particular way, the speed, the confidence, the specific angle, was consistent with someone who had performed a similar action before, in a different context. This detail was not released immediately. It emerged in later appeals, as investigators tried to sketch the psychological geography of the person they were looking for. And when you hold that detail alongside the orange workwear fibers, and the local knowledge required to navigate that lane, a specific kind of picture begins to form. Not a face. Not a name. But a suggestion of a life, a working life, a rural life, the kind of person who would not be remarkable in Devon in November 1997. The kind of person who would be invisible to everyone around them because they looked like anyone else. Other things were found in the area. Scattered through the fields around the murder site, police discovered a number of man-made dens, small constructions in the undergrowth, the kind that children make sometimes, but that could also be made by an adult who needed somewhere to be without being seen. Police appealed for anyone who'd built or used those dens to come forward and eliminate themselves from the inquiry. They also found a black bin liner containing an individual's personal effects. There were unidentified fingerprints on the bag. Those fingerprints remain unmatched. And then there are the things that were not found. The knife. No murder weapon has ever been located. Whoever carried it away carried it successfully, either into a vehicle, into a field, into water, or simply into a life that never intersected with the investigation in the way investigators hoped. In nearly 30 years of searching, a forensic review and renewed appeal and technological improvement, the knife has never surfaced. By the time Jerry Bushell found his daughter, it was 7:30 in the evening. He had been searching on foot. Suzanne had stayed at the house, because someone needed to be there in case Kate came home, in case there was a phone call, in case the mundane explanation arrived and everyone could exhale. Jerry had gone out into the dark. He had walked around the estate first, calling her name, looking on the roads she might have taken. Finding nothing. No girl, no dog, no indication of where they'd gone. And then he went to the lane. He found Gemma first. The Jack Russell was in the field, near the gateway. She was there. She was alive. She was waiting. Dogs don't have the capacity to understand what has happened, but they do have the capacity to stay. Gemma had stayed. That detail, the faithful, bewildered presence of a small dog by a body she could not help, is one of the most quietly devastating details in this entire story. She had not run home. She had not gone for help. She had simply remained. And then Jerry saw Kate. She was lying in the field. 300 yards from their front door. 300 yards, the length of 3 football pitches, the distance of a short walk, the span of 2 or 3 minutes at a comfortable pace. 300 yards from the house where a birthday present for Tim was sitting. 300 yards from the desk where her finished homework was waiting for Monday. She was on her back. Her long blonde hair was spread around her. Her Reebok jogging pants had been pulled down. Jerry Bushell found his daughter in that field at 7:30 on a November evening, and there are no words adequate to what that means. There are only the facts, arranged in their terrible sequence, and the understanding that some things change a person's life so completely that the life before and the life after are not recognizable as the same life. He had found her. Now everything would begin. Within hours, Exwick Lane was sealed. Blue and white tape across the hedgerow gaps, police vehicles at each end, the lane itself transformed from a dog-walking path into a crime scene. Officers moved through the fields in lines, in the dark, with torches. More than 160 detectives and staff would be deployed to Operation Deakin, the name given to the investigation, in the days that followed. It would become Devon and Cornwall Police's biggest and most high-profile murder investigation. It would cost more than £1 million before the first decade was out. On the 18th of November, 3 days after Kate died, 3,000 Exeter City football fans observed a minute's silence at St. James Park. 2,000 posters were distributed by local press. The city was in a state of shock that had a specific quality to it, the shock of a place that had believed itself to be safe, confronting the evidence that safety is never guaranteed. Parents changed routines. Children were told not to walk alone. The ordinary geography of Exwick, the fields, the lane, the styles that everyone knew and used, was suddenly a different kind of place. A place where something had happened. In those first days, the police knocked on doors. 5,000 of them, across the area. They collected DNA samples, 5,000 of those too, from men in Exwick and the surrounding area. By the 1st of December, they had DNA tested 300 men in the neighborhood. By January, they were fingerprinting residents. The scale of the response was exceptional, and it reflected something the investigating officers understood immediately, that this crime, in a place like this, against a child like this, was the kind of thing that could not go unanswered. And yet it did. The days became weeks. The weeks became months. The 5,000 interviews did not produce an arrest. The DNA samples did not match. The orange fibers, examined, analyzed, re-examined, were unusual, even rare in terms of the specific dye and material, but unusual is not the same as traceable to a specific person. The weapon was gone. The blue car was gone. The running man was gone. The vagrant had never been found. 3 suspects were eventually brought in for questioning. All 3 were released without charge. The investigation kept turning over the same stones, looking for something underneath that hadn't been found yet. And then, in January of 1998, the case appeared on Crime Watch. Presented by Jill Dando, who would herself be murdered the following year, in a case that would also remain unsolved for years, the segment included a reconstruction of Kate's final movements and an interview with lead detective Mike Stevens. The appeal was made to a national audience. The lead detective looked directly into the camera and said something that he clearly believed, someone in the community of Exwick knew who had done this. Someone was sitting with that knowledge. Someone had chosen not to speak. He was asking them to change their mind. Nobody did. Or if they did, what they offered wasn't enough. There is a particular way that a major investigation looks from the inside of the community it descends on. From the outside, it is procedural, officers and evidence and appeals on the evening news. But from inside Exwick in the winter and spring of 1997 and 1998, the investigation would have been a constant presence, inescapable and exhausting, a reminder that could not be looked away from. Every knock on the door was a question. Every question was a reminder. And the reminder was always the same, someone here knows something, and they haven't said it yet. The lane was eventually reopened. Life, in its stubborn insistence, began to return to some approximation of normal. People walked their dogs again, eventually, though not the same way they had before. Parents who let their children walk alone now drove them instead. The fields that had been unremarkable were now something else, a landscape with a shadow across it, a place where the name Kate Bushell would be said in low voices by people who had known her, or known of her, or simply known the lane. What was known, in those early months, was shaped by what police chose to release and what they chose to hold back. This is standard in murder investigations. Some details are kept close to protect the integrity of the case, to ensure that any future confession or witness account can be verified against information only the killer could know. But the decisions about what to reveal and what to withhold created a strange public experience, a case everyone knew about, with a victim everyone felt they understood, but with the crucial facts, the specific details of the attack, the wound, the weapon, the positioning, held at arm's length. What the public knew was this: a 14-year-old girl had been killed in a lane she walked regularly. She had been killed with a knife. Her father had found her. There were orange fibers. There was a blue car. There were 3 suspicious figures. No one had been charged. What the public didn't know, or didn't know in full, was the detail about the clothing being disturbed. The assessment about the attacker's possible familiarity with slaughtering animals. The precise nature of the wound. The contamination problem that would emerge years later with the fibers, a story within the story that speaks to how fragile forensic evidence can be, and how much depends on the first hours and days after a crime. That contamination is worth understanding. In 1999, a forensic review of the orange fibers was conducted. During that review, a technician's own clothing shed similar fibers onto the evidence sample. The contamination was eventually discovered, but the damage to the integrity of that sample had been done. A subsequent, entirely new forensic review was undertaken with a different provider, in the hope of recovering DNA from the original fibers, from the body, from anywhere that might have survived the years and the handling. The hope was real. The technology had improved enormously since 1997. What had been impossible to detect in the late 90s was no longer impossible. But results are not promises. Improvement is not resolution. In the meantime, the investigation continued in the way that long-running unsolved cases continue, with periodic review, with renewed appeals on significant anniversaries, with the exhausting work of following lines of inquiry that each time seemed like they might lead somewhere and each time led to the same place they'd always led. 3 suspects. Released without charge. There is a question that sits at the heart of every long-running investigation, and it is this: what would it take to break it open? What single piece of information, what single moment of someone deciding to speak rather than stay silent, would change everything? In the Bushell case, investigators have been consistent and explicit in their belief: someone knows. Not suspects this, not has a theory. Knows. The senior investigating officer on the 25th anniversary review, Detective Inspector Rob Back, said it plainly. Someone is holding the final piece of information. They may have withheld it at the time due to loyalty, to intimidation, or simply because they didn't understand its relevance. But they have it. What that person, if they exist, has been living with is its own study in psychology. The weight of an unspoken secret is not a constant. It shifts and changes with time, becoming something that people find ways to carry without being crushed by it. People tell themselves things. That it wasn't relevant, really. That it wouldn't have made a difference. That they didn't see enough to matter. That enough time has passed. That saying something now would only cause more pain. These are the stories people tell themselves when the truth is too costly or too complicated or too frightening to speak. And the telling of those stories, over and over, year after year, eventually starts to feel like memory itself. Starts to feel like the truth. But somewhere in Exwick, or somewhere adjacent to it, in the life of someone who worked a rural job, drove a blue car or van, knew the fields well enough to use them deliberately, the knowledge exists. The case has never gone cold in the way some cases do, the way that complete absence of evidence eventually allows. There is no complete absence here. There are fibers, and sightings, and a psychological profile, and the certainty of investigators who have spent decades thinking about a lane in Devon on a November afternoon. The case is not cold. It is unresolved. Those are different things. And the family. Tim Bushell, Kate's brother, was nearly 16 when she died. He is in his 40s now. He has marked every anniversary of her death for nearly 3 decades. On the 25th anniversary, he made a statement. He said there was not a day that passed when his family didn't think of Kate. What she would have achieved. What she would have become. All the family milestones that went on without her, birthdays and celebrations and ordinary Saturdays that accumulated over 25 years, all of them carrying the shape of an absence. His birthday was coming up when she died. She'd bought him a Simpsons comic. He never got to receive it from her. There is a specific and almost unbearable detail in the emotional archaeology of this case. Kate had finished her homework the day she died. She had done her research, and she had come home, and she had sat at her desk and completed her work, and then she had gone to walk a dog and she hadn't come back. The finished homework. The unwrapped birthday present. The CD she'd bought that morning. These things, small, ordinary, mundane things, are the true inventory of a life interrupted. Not the crime scene and the fibers and the investigation. These things. The Christmas of 1997 happened 6 weeks after Kate's death. The New Year. The reconstruction of her final walk, screened in shop windows around the city in late November, showing the route she would have taken, asking the people of Exeter to remember what they had seen. 3,000 fans in a football ground standing in silence for a girl they'd never met. And then the spring of 1998. And then autumn. And then another winter. The case did not break. In September 1998, Mike Stevens appeared on Crime Watch again, on a program called Still Unsolved. He said he was 90% certain that the killer was a local man or someone with local knowledge. He said the man was right-handed. He said the man possibly owned or drove a blue vehicle. He said the men may have had prior experience slaughtering animals. And then he said something that was both a warning and a forecast. He said that unless someone came forward with information, the killer might not be caught until he struck again. Less than a month later, in October 1998, 41-year-old Lyn Bryant left her home on the Roseland Peninsula in Cornwall to walk her lurcher dog along a country lane. She was stabbed multiple times. Her body was found in the gateway to a field. Her killer has also never been found. Devon and Cornwall Police quickly noted the similarities. Both killings in the southwest of England. Both victims walking dogs alone on isolated rural lanes. Both killed with knives. Both scenes with no apparent motive of robbery or sexual assault, though in both cases there were signs of clothing disturbance. Both scenes had witnessed sightings of unidentified vehicles, blue cars or vans in Kate's case, a pale van in Lyn's. The similarities were too consistent to ignore. And they were too consistent for the families to ignore, either. Were they the same killer? Investigators concluded that the possibility was high. Not certain, 2 separate investigations, 2 separate sets of evidence, 2 different police operations. But the modus operandi, the geography, the timing, all of it suggested that the same person may have been moving through the southwest in the late 90s, hunting along the lanes where women and girls walked dogs, learning the rhythms of the countryside, using isolation as a tool. If that was true, then the warning Mike Stevens issued in September 1998, that the killer might not be caught until he struck again, had been prophetic in the worst possible way. He had struck again. And he still hadn't been caught. The 90s had a specific texture when it came to murder investigations. The tools available to forensic scientists were powerful but limited in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the vantage point of the present. DNA technology existed, but it was not the fine-grained instrument it would become. Fiber analysis was well established, but trace evidence, the microscopic and invisible residue of human presence, could be complicated by contamination in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until the investigation was already underway. Databases were smaller. Algorithms didn't exist. The matching of an unusual fiber type to a specific manufacturer or a specific batch of workwear required manual research, physical samples, contacts in the textile industry, time. The orange fibers from Kate's body were submitted to analysis, and what came back was detailed but not immediately actionable. The fibers were unusual. The specific combination of the dye, an azoic orange dye of a particular shade, and the cotton composition was not common in everyday clothing. It was the kind of dye and material used in industrial and occupational clothing, the kind of garment worn by someone who works outside, who works with machinery or animals or heavy material, who comes home with their clothes already orange before the first wash. The police said the fibers were quite unusual, not ubiquitous, not from the kind of clothing everyone has in their wardrobe. This was a person with a specific working life. But specific is not unique. The fiber profile eliminated some possibilities and didn't resolve others. It was a clue, not a key. It narrowed the field without closing the door. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation added more texture to the picture. The killer was right-handed. He almost certainly had local knowledge, not just passing familiarity, but real, specific, working knowledge of the fields around Exwick Lane, including the stiles, the field boundaries, and the gateway where Kate was found. Police said the location was simply too obscure, too specifically local, for someone to have stumbled across it by accident. The lane was not on any tourist route. It was not the kind of place you found unless you'd been shown it, or had found it yourself over repeated visits. It was a place you had to know. The killer may have had a blue vehicle, a small car or van. He was likely in the area regularly enough that his presence in the lane wouldn't have been remarked on. He brought a knife, which means he came with intention, or he carried one habitually as part of his working life. And the way he used that knife, the specific, efficient nature of the wound, suggested, to investigators, that this was not the first time he had cut a throat. The comparison was to the slaughtering of sheep, a practice that requires the same movement, the same confidence, the same direction. It is a rural skill. It belongs to a particular kind of working life. All of this, assembled together, generates the outline of a person. A working man. Local, or locally connected. Someone with knowledge of farm work or animal husbandry. Someone with a vehicle. Someone who knew the lane. Someone who, in the winter of 1997, was unremarkable in every visible way, the kind of person who lived in the community, was known to their neighbors, went about their working week, and was never looked at twice. The invisibility of the ordinary is perhaps the most frightening thing about this case. Serial killers and predators are often imagined as identifiable, as people who carry their violence visibly, who give off signals, who are known for something that marks them out. But the profile that emerges from the Bushell investigation is not that. It is a profile of profound, functional normality. A person who could be standing in a queue at the supermarket, walking into a pub, driving past a school, and drawing no more attention than a lamppost. Someone whose life, from the outside, looked exactly like everyone else's life. And yet, in the weeks before the 15th of November, someone had been in those fields. Someone had possibly pitched a tent near the spot where Kate was killed. Someone had been seen in the same heavy coat on multiple occasions along the same lane that Kate regularly walked. Something, or someone, had been establishing a familiarity with that specific location, at that specific time of year, that would later take on a significance no one who saw it had understood at the time. The question that has never been fully answered is whether Kate was chosen, or whether she was simply there. This is not a trivial distinction. It bears on the entire psychological architecture of the crime. If Kate was chosen, if someone had watched her walk that route, had noted the time she left and the route she took and the predictability of her routine, then the crime was premeditated in a very specific way. It required surveillance. It required patience. It required a cold, deliberate willingness to plan. And it suggests that the killer knew something about Kate specifically, her habits, her schedule, her dog-walking obligations. But police also noted something unusual about the walk on the day she died. Kate did not routinely walk Gemma every Saturday. She did it when the Smiths were away, when the specific circumstances of a neighbor needing help created the opportunity. The walk on the 15th of November wasn't a guaranteed weekly routine. It was something that happened because the Smiths happened to be away on that particular weekend. Someone watching for Kate's Saturday dog walks would not necessarily have known she would be there that afternoon. This leaves the other possibility, that Kate was not chosen, but found. That the killer was already on the lane, or near it, for reasons of his own, because he knew the area, because he was working or living nearby, because the lane was part of his regular world. And Kate, walking alone with a small dog in the November dusk, was simply there. Simply available. Simply caught in the terrible geometry of being in the wrong place at a moment when someone with a knife had decided to stop waiting. Both possibilities are frightening, but they're frightening in different ways. Targeted violence suggests a specific malice, a relationship, however one-sided and unspoken, between killer and victim. Opportunistic violence suggests something colder and more impersonal, a predator and a random intersection, the pure bad luck of an afternoon. The investigators' view, based on the evidence they have, has leaned toward the local, the knowing, the deliberate. Not necessarily targeted at Kate herself, but targeted at a category of person, in a specific kind of place, at a specific kind of time. Someone who knew how to find that situation and exploit it. The vagrant is the most unresolved element of the pre-murder landscape. The man in the heavy coat, seen repeatedly in the fields and lanes around Exwick. The man who had been camping near the murder site the weekend before. The man who came out from behind the trees and startled a dog walker 3 days before Kate died. He was reported to police. He was described. And then he vanished. No confirmed sighting after Kate's death. No tent in the field. No man in a heavy coat seen in the area again. Whether this represented his sudden departure from the area, his transformation into someone less conspicuous, or something more sinister, nobody knows. He was never identified. He was never found. The fingerprints from the black bin liner in the field were never matched to anyone in any database. There is a strange and disorienting thing that happens when you read the case files and the appeals and the testimony from this investigation. Everything connects, and nothing resolves. Every piece of evidence points somewhere interesting, and then the trail stops. The blue car points to a man who won't come forward. The orange fibers point to a working life that's described but never identified. The vagrant points to a presence that evaporated. The running man points to a figure who ran in a direction that nobody followed in time. The investigation built a map of people who were there, and every one of those people disappeared from the map before anyone could reach them. The 22nd of November, 1997, 1 week after Kate's death, police staged a public reconstruction of her final walk. Actors retraced her route along Exwick Lane at the same time of day, in similar weather, with a small dog. The reconstruction was filmed and later shown in shop windows around the city and in supermarkets, creating a loop of footage that replayed Kate's last walk on a continuous screen for any passing shopper to watch. The goal was to jog memories. To make someone remember what they had seen on that afternoon. To find the person who had been in the lane and hadn't yet said so. The reconstruction generated calls. Some of those calls added context, added detail, added witnesses who hadn't initially come forward. But the critical name, the identity behind the blue car, the identity of the running man, the identity of the vagrant, never arrived. By early December, police had collected DNA from 300 men in Exwick. By January, they were fingerprinting residents. The investigation was total, in the way that only the most serious and most public crimes generate. And in its totality, it found everything except the answer. 3 suspects were brought in and questioned. 3 were released. The reasons for their release, insufficient evidence, alibis, DNA that didn't match, are part of the investigation that remains largely private. What is known is that none of the 3 were charged. What that means for the investigation's current state is unclear. The 3 may have been wholly innocent. They may have been questioned for proximity rather than evidence. The investigation may have moved on, may have found new leads, may be focused on a direction that has not been made public. Or it may be, as it has always been, waiting for the person who knows to decide to speak. 20 years is a long time to carry something. In 2017, Devon and Cornwall Police launched a new appeal on the 20th anniversary of Kate's death. Detective Superintendent Paul Bergen led the review. A new video was released. New appeals went out. And something unexpected happened. The appeal generated 204 calls and messages. 204 pieces of information from people who had been sitting on them for 20 years. The review identified 10 new lines of inquiry from those calls. 10 threads that had not been pulled before. The nature of those threads has not been made public, because open investigations do not share everything. But the fact of them is significant. 20 years after the murder, people who had been silent were speaking. People who had dismissed something they'd seen or heard as irrelevant, or people who had been intimidated into silence, or people who had protected someone out of loyalty or confusion or fear, were picking up the phone and saying something. What changed after 20 years? Time, primarily. The children of 1997 were now adults. The people who might have been in relationships with suspects or near suspects were perhaps no longer in those relationships. The intimidation that had kept some lips sealed had perhaps faded, or the person doing the intimidating had died, or moved away, or lost their hold. The loyalty that had protected someone, a son, a husband, a friend, a colleague, had perhaps eroded as those relationships changed. Perhaps some people had simply watched their own children grow to 14 and found something in them they couldn't stand. There is a particular phenomenon in long-running cold cases, though this case is not cold, it is simply unresolved, where the passing of time functions not as an erasure but as a loosening. Information that was locked down by circumstance slowly becomes unlockable. The person who couldn't speak in 1997 because they were afraid, or confused, or loyal, or simply unable to accept what they suspected, that person is still there, somewhere, having lived with this knowledge for 28 years, and they may be closer to speaking now than they have ever been. The £20,000 reward offered by Crime Stoppers on the 25th anniversary in 2022 is an acknowledgement of that possibility. £20,000 is not nothing. And more importantly, the Crime Stoppers number is anonymous. You do not need to give your name. You do not need to go to a police station. You do not need to appear in a court. You call a number and you say what you know, and someone with the authority to act takes it from there. The anonymity is designed precisely for the person who has knowledge but who cannot bring themselves to deliver it with their name attached. But let's return to the landscape of 1997 and ask a question that investigators themselves have asked, and that has no clean answer. In the weeks before Kate's death, was something building? The vagrant in the fields. The tent. The men who came out from behind the trees 3 days before the murder. These sightings, taken together, describe a presence in the area that was more than passing. Someone was there. Someone was becoming familiar with that lane, those fields, those rhythms. The regular dog walkers who used Exwick Lane were part of those rhythms. They appeared at predictable times, alone or in small groups, moving through a landscape that was quiet and largely unobserved. The question of whether this was stalking, whether someone was specifically watching, learning the patterns of the lane, identifying vulnerable moments and vulnerable people, is one that investigators have not been able to answer with certainty. What they have been able to say is that the murder does not look like a sudden impulse. A sudden impulse does not produce a knife. A sudden impulse does not produce the precise, controlled violence described in the pathologist's findings. A sudden impulse does not produce someone who can disappear from a crime scene without leaving any trace that would identify them, who can walk past the evidence they've left behind and go back to their life and never be found. Whatever happened on Exwick Lane on the afternoon of the 15th of November was not random in the sense of being accidental. Even if the victim was not chosen in advance, even if Kate was simply the person who was there when the opportunity presented itself, the perpetrator chose to be there. Chose to be in that lane at that time with a knife. That choice was not spontaneous. And then there is the running man. He has never been fully explained, and in some ways he is the most haunting figure in the entire case. Because while the men by the blue car might have a mundane explanation, someone who was parking for entirely innocent reasons and happened to be near the lane at the wrong time and panicked when he heard about the murder and didn't come forward out of fear, the running man has a harder time finding an innocent explanation. He was seen running out of control, very fast, down a muddy slippery hill. The direction was from where Kate's body was found. The time was shortly after 7:30, half a mile away, while the police helicopter was already in the air above. He was running in the specific, chaotic way of someone who had lost their composure. Not the purposeful running of exercise. The desperate running of aftermath. He never came forward. Not in 1997. Not in 1998, when Crime Watch aired. Not in 2017. Not in 2022. In 28 years, the man who was seen running frantically from the direction of a murder scene while a police helicopter circled overhead has not once picked up a phone or knocked on a door or sent a letter to say, "I was there. I was running." Here is why. That silence is its own kind of evidence. Not legal evidence. Police cannot charge someone for not coming forward, and the fact of not coming forward does not establish guilt in any court. But in the court of reason and probability, the sustained, deliberate, decades-long refusal to explain your presence in that field on that evening speaks loudly about what you know and why you cannot say it. There were also the sightings of blood. Multiple sources refer to a blood-soaked figure seen in the area, not confirmed in official police statements with full detail, but present in the community memory and the written accounts of those who lived there and spoke to neighbors in those first terrible days. A figure seen running with what looked like blood on them. Whether this overlaps entirely with the running men, or represents a separate sighting, or is the distortion of memory and rumor that invariably accumulates around violent events in tight communities, it is impossible to say with certainty. What is clear is that the area around the murder site was not quiet in the hour after Kate died. People were moving. Things were being seen. And the majority of what was seen never came back to the investigation in a form that could be acted on. In January of 1999, 14 months after Kate's death, 3 months after Lyn Bryant's murder, a man attacked a mother and her teenage daughter who were walking their dog on a country lane in Netherton, near Newton Abbot in Devon. The man drove his car deliberately into the daughter's legs. He forced them into a nearby field. He held a knife to the girl's throat and told them to do as he said. They fought back. They got away. The men drove off in a blue-gray Vauxhall Cavalier. Devon and Cornwall Police said the similarities with the murders of Kate Bushell and Lyn Bryant were, in their words, too obvious to ignore. The man was never identified. 3 incidents, across Devon and Cornwall, in 14 months. Women and girls walking dogs on isolated country lanes. knives. Blue or pale-colored vehicles. Attacks that came from nowhere, that were driven by no discernible motive of robbery or conventional assault, that seemed to be about the act itself, the particular combination of isolation and vulnerability and access. Were they all connected? The police have never confirmed a definitive link between all three cases. The attack in Netherton, because the victims survived and fought back, may have prevented a third murder. Or it may have been an unrelated incident of opportunistic violence that happened to share surface similarities. In the absence of DNA matches or identified suspects, it is impossible to say. What can be said is that in the late 1990s, something was moving through the lanes of the rural southwest of England, and whatever it was, it found women walking dogs, and it carried a knife, and it hasn't been caught. The Lyn Bryant case developed its own separate forensic life. In 2018, investigators announced that a DNA profile had been isolated from evidence in the Bryant murder, a significant development that raised the hope that, if the cases were linked, the profile could eventually identify a perpetrator in both killings. Testing of the Bushell evidence against that profile was reportedly undertaken, though the results of any such comparison have not been made public in detail. The investigation continues. For the families, the investigation continuing is both a comfort and a torment. It means the case has not been abandoned. It means that somewhere in a Devon police database, Kate Bushell's name is still active, still being cross-referenced against new information, still worth someone's working day. But it also means that every anniversary comes without an answer. Every renewal of the appeal is a reminder that the answer is still out there, held by someone who has chosen to keep it, and that the choice to keep it is an ongoing one, renewed every day, every year, for 28 years. The weight of 28 years is not a metaphor in the Bushell family. It is a literal, daily accumulation. Tim Bushell has spent more of his life in the aftermath of his sister's murder than he spent with her alive. He was 15 when she died. He is now in his 40s. The ratio is stark, a few years of childhood with a younger sister who bought him Simpsons comics, versus nearly 3 decades of living with the absence of an answer. In his statement on the 25th anniversary, Tim said something that is worth sitting with. He spoke about the milestones. About the things Kate was excluded from by her murder, not just her own future, but the family's shared future. The birthdays she should have been at. The events she should have witnessed. The ordinary accumulation of a family moving through time together, which every family takes entirely for granted until the taking for granted is taken away. There is a grief in unresolved cases that is distinct from the grief that eventually arrives in cases where a killer is caught. It is not that the catching of a killer undoes the death, nothing does that. But there is something in the absence of resolution that keeps a wound open in a specific way. It is difficult to fully mourn someone whose killer has not been identified, because part of the story is still being told. Part of the truth has not yet been spoken. And families like the Bushells have to live both the loss of the person they loved and the grinding, ongoing uncertainty of the unanswered question. Who did this? And why won't anyone say so? These are two different questions, and they carry different weights. The first is about fact, about the identity of a person, their name, their face, the specific history that brought them to a lane in Devon on a November afternoon. The second is about human behavior, about the psychology of knowing and staying silent, about loyalty and fear and the particular moral cowardice of protecting a killer with an action. If Mike Stevens was right in 1998 when he said he was 90% certain the killer was a local man or someone with local connections, and everything about the evidence supports the direction of that certainty, then the silence keeping this case open is local too. It lives in Exwick, or in the surrounding area, in the conversations people do not have, the things they have decided not to say, the names they have kept to themselves. It lives inside someone's family, someone's friendship, someone's working relationship. It is being actively maintained, every single day, by at least one person who knows something that would break this case open. What is it like to be that person? What is it like to carry that knowledge through 28 Christmases, 28 Novembers, 28 anniversaries? The human mind is extraordinarily adept at self-protection. It creates narratives that allow people to live with themselves, that transform what they know from something damning into something ambiguous, something inconclusive, something that could have multiple explanations. People who know something about a crime can convince themselves, over years, that what they know is less significant than it is. That the detail they dismissed at the time was rightly dismissed. That the person they've been protecting would not, could not, must not be the one responsible. That the alternative, coming forward, naming a name, appending a life and a family and a community, is simply too large to contemplate. And every year that passes without the arrest, the silence is reinforced. Nothing happened. Nobody found out. The secret held. But the secret is not the killers alone. That's the thing about this case that is easy to miss in the procedural detail. The secret, whatever knowledge someone in Exwick or connected to Exwick is carrying about this murder, belongs to more than one person. Because human beings talk. They tell their partners, or their parents, or their closest friends, about the things that frighten them. They let things slip in moments of pressure or drink or intimacy. They confide. And those who receive the confidence either act on it or they don't. They become complicit in the silence or they break it. Over 28 years, the circle of people who know something about this case, or who know someone who knows something, has likely widened rather than narrowed. Time has not sealed the secret. Time has given it more opportunities to escape. And still it hasn't. The question of the serial killer theory deserves its own moment of stillness. Because if Lyn Bryant's murder and Kate Bushell's murder are connected, and the structural similarities are difficult to dismiss, then what the southwest of England experienced in 1997 and 1998 was not a single crime but the beginning of a pattern. A pattern that may have continued in the Netherton attack. A pattern that, if it exists, suggests a person who survived those years and kept moving and may still be alive. The thought is unsettling in a way that is different from the sadness of an individual murder. An individual murder, however devastating, is contained, a single act, a single perpetrator, a single family absorbing the shock. A pattern of killings is something else. It suggests a predator who has spent decades going uncaught, who may have committed other offenses that were never linked, who has lived alongside ordinary people in an ordinary community, growing older, perhaps quieter, perhaps more careful, but never identified. The DNA profile isolated in the Lyn Bryant case offers a possible key to that identification. Modern forensic science has capabilities that 1997 could not have imagined. Genetic genealogy, the technique that has broken open cold cases across the world, that identified the Golden State Killer after decades, that has matched crime scene DNA to families through public genealogy databases, is a tool that now exists and is being applied in unsolved UK cases. The question is whether the DNA recovered from the Bryant scene is of sufficient quality and quantity to support that kind of analysis. Whether the link to Kate's case, if it exists, can be established through that DNA. Investigators have been careful not to make promises. The science moves forward, but the evidence is old, and old evidence has limits. What can be said is that the case is not standing still. The technology is not standing still. The investigation is not standing still. The people who have been holding information, for loyalty, for fear, for self-protection, are not standing still either. They are getting older. The person they've been protecting may be dead, or may be dying, or may themselves have said something in the long years since the murder that changed the calculations of the person keeping their silence. There is a theory, held by a small number of researchers and former officers, that links Kate Bushell's murder not just to Lyn Bryant's, but to an even older case, the murder of Helen Fleet in 1987, in Weston-super-Mare, who was attacked and killed while walking her dogs in Whirlebbury Woods. Helen Fleet was 66 years old. She was stabbed repeatedly and beaten and strangled. The killing was frenzied and without apparent motive. No robbery, no sexual assault. A violent and apparently motiveless attack on a woman walking a dog alone in a quiet place. If the same killer committed all three murders, from 1987 to 1997 to 1998, then the gap between the Fleet murder and Kate's death would need explaining. 10 years between the first and second killing is a long interval. Investigators have noted this. The theory is not widely endorsed. The Devon and Cornwall Police have not officially linked the Fleet case to the Bushell case. The modes of the attacks are different enough to raise genuine doubt. Helen Fleet was stabbed many times with a shorter blade and also beaten. Kate Bushell was killed with a single, controlled, precise movement with a much longer blade. These differences suggest different emotional states, different intentions, different histories. What links them, speculatively, is the category, women walking dogs on isolated lanes, attacked without apparent motive, killed completely, and left in a place where they would be found. If there is a serial killer in this story, and the evidence for one is suggestive rather than conclusive, then the question of what he looks like today, whether he is still alive, whether he has grown old somewhere in the southwest and carried this with him to whatever stage of life he now inhabits, is a question that investigation has not yet answered. But the world has changed since 1997. DNA exists in family databases now. Genealogy sites hold the genetic information of millions of people, and through those networks, individuals who have never submitted a DNA sample can be identified through the profiles of their relatives. The Golden State Killer was identified this way. Others have been. The technique is expanding, and it is coming closer to the kinds of cases that have resisted every other approach. The person who killed Kate Bushell, whether they acted alone, whether they killed again, whether they are alive or dead, left something behind. More than 100 orange fibers. A psychological profile. A wound that describes a specific skill and a specific kind of strength. These things exist. They are in the evidence logs of Operation Deakin. They are waiting to be matched. The question is only when. November 15th comes every year. It comes the way significant dates always come, with the peculiar quality of an anniversary that refuses to become purely ceremonial. For the Bushell family, the 15th of November is not a date on a calendar. It is a recurring moment of confrontation with the same unanswered question, dressed in new weather, in a world that has moved on in every way except the one that matters most. 28 Novembers. 28 times the light has pulled itself short in Devon. 28 times the fields around Exwick Lane have gone from amber to brown to nothing. And 28 times, no answer. Kate Bushell was born in 1983. She would be 42 years old today. It is not difficult, in the imagination, to construct the shape of the life that was taken from her, the GCSEs she would have sat in 1998, the school friendships she would have carried into adulthood and perhaps into parenthood. The career she might have found. The person she might have loved. The dog she might have finally owned. The ordinary accumulation of a life, which does not require magnificence or fame or achievement of any exceptional kind, which requires only the chance to continue. She didn't get that chance. She was found 300 yards from her front door, in a field she knew, on a lane she'd walked before, on a Saturday afternoon when the only remarkable thing about her plans was their complete and total unremarkableness. She went to walk a dog. That was all. That was the whole of it. She went to walk a dog and she didn't come back. And the person who prevented her from coming back has been living their life, somewhere, ever since. This is the detail that sits at the bottom of the case and will not shift. Not the evidence, not the fibers, not the blue car or the running men or the vagrant in the heavy coat. The detail that sits at the bottom is this: the killer is likely still alive. Killers in 1997, unless they were already elderly, would typically be in their 50s, 60s, or 70s now. The man by the blue car, described as between 30 and 40, would be in his late 50s or 60s today. The running man, if he was younger, could be in his 40s. The vagrant could be anywhere, could be dead, could be in a different county, could be in a different country. But the man by the car, the man who was 100 yards from where Kate was found and has never come forward, he is almost certainly still out there. And someone knows who he is. This is not a dramatic claim. It is simply the mathematics of community. A man in his 30s in 1997, in the area around Exwick, driving a blue vehicle, had a life. He had people in that life, a family, colleagues, neighbors, friends. He had a job, probably in manual labor of some kind, because of the workwear fibers. He had a vehicle that was noticed. He had a face that was described. He was not invisible to everyone. He was invisible to the investigation, but not to the world. Someone knew him. Someone drove past him in a car and waved. Someone sat next to him on a Saturday night and had a drink. Someone saw him come home and noticed something different about him in the days after Kate Bushell's murder became front-page news. And that someone, or those people, plural, because secrets of this magnitude rarely have only one keeper, have been deciding, every single year, to stay quiet. There is something that needs to be said about the nature of that decision. It is sometimes imagined as a single, clear-cut choice, a moment where someone knows the truth and simply decides to protect it. But that is rarely how complicit silence works. It works instead as a slow erosion of the moment when speaking would have been natural. In 1997, in the weeks after the murder, saying something, mentioning a name, describing a suspicion, sharing what you'd seen or heard, would have felt urgent and obvious. The case was everywhere. the police were knocking on every door. The atmosphere of the moment created its own pressure toward disclosure. But then the weeks became months, and the months became years, and the original moment for speaking passed. And speaking later required not just the original information, but the explanation of why you hadn't spoken before. That explanation is its own obstacle. The longer you wait, the more the act of speaking requires you to account for the waiting. And the accounting is harder, in many ways, than the original disclosure would have been. This is how silence compounds. It is not held in place by a single decision but by a series of smaller decisions, each one easier than the last because each one simply continues what the previous one established. By the time a decade has passed, the silence has become part of the person. By the time 2 decades have passed, it is almost structural. It has been built into the way someone understands their own life. To break it would be to rebuild the understanding of themselves they've been operating with for 20 years. And yet, people break these silences. They do. The 204 calls that came in after the 2017 appeal, those were people breaking silences. Some of them had been sitting on those silences for 20 years. Something moved them to pick up the phone. A milestone birthday. A death in the family. A late night thought that wouldn't quiet. The image, maybe, of a 42-year-old woman who doesn't exist because she never got the chance. The appeal that Devon and Cornwall Police have made, consistently and without equivocation, is to those people. The ones sitting on something. The ones who dismissed what they knew as irrelevant, or who protected someone out of loyalty that has since grown thin, or who were frightened then and are less frightened now. The appeal is simple, and it has been made in the same language every time. If you know something, say it. Even if you think it's small. Even if you're not sure it matters. Even if you've been sitting on it for 28 years. The reward is £20,000. The line is anonymous. But the real appeal is not about money or anonymity. The real appeal is about a family that has spent 28 Novembers without an answer, and about the fact that someone, somewhere, has the capacity to end that. Kate's brother Tim has spoken publicly every time an anniversary has come around. He has done it with a consistency and a patience that is, in itself, extraordinary. He has not given up. His family has not given up. They have continued to engage with the investigation, to make themselves visible, to put human faces and human words to the abstract fact of an unsolved murder. They do this not because they believe it is likely to change anything on its own, but because they understand that the alternative, silence, withdrawal, the choice to stop asking, would represent a capitulation to the same silence that has protected the killer for all these years. There are things about this case that will never be publicly known. The details that police have kept back, and there are details, specific and carefully guarded, exist for reasons that the investigation still requires. The full picture of what was done to Kate in that field, the specific sequence of events, the things that the killer did and said and left behind that only the killer and the investigators know, these things have been withheld not out of carelessness but out of strategy. Because when the person responsible is finally identified, when they finally sit across from an investigator in a room, those details will matter. They will be the thing that separates the confession from the denial, the truth from the constructed alternative. The investigation is not cold. It is alive with the specific and disciplined patience of people who believe they will eventually find the answer. Modern forensic technology continues to develop. The DNA profile from the Bryant case, if it matches evidence in the Bushell case, and if it is of sufficient quality for genealogical matching, could change everything in a way that no witness appeal can. It would require no one's conscience. It would require only a database and a match. And somewhere in the national and international genealogy databases, in the DNA of someone's family member who has submitted a profile to find their ancestry, the key may already exist. It may be sitting in a database right now, waiting for the cross-reference that will pull it into connection with the evidence from a field in Devon in November 1997. But let's not end on technology. Let's end on something more human, because this is, at its core, a human story. On the morning of the 15th of November, 1997, Kate Bushell went into Exeter with her mother. They went to the library. She did her homework research. They went to the Virgin Megastore. She bought a CD she'd been wanting. She bought a Simpsons comic for her brother's birthday. She sat in the passenger seat on the way home, probably thinking about nothing in particular, the way you think when the day has been good and the task is done and the afternoon is still ahead of you. She went home, and she sat at her desk, and she finished her schoolwork. She told her parents she'd be 20 minutes. She picked up a lead. A small dog turned in a circle. And then she went out into the November light, down a lane she knew, 300 yards from home. Gemma waited for her. The lane remembers nothing. The fields keep no record. The hedgerows that were bare in November 1997 have grown and been cut back and grown again 28 times over. Exwick has changed, and not changed, in the way that places do, some houses the same, some faces the same, some routines exactly as they were. People still walk dogs down Exwick Lane. It is still a quiet, rural cut-through used by locals. It is still not well known to outsiders. It is still exactly the kind of place that requires a specific familiarity to navigate. The person who navigated it that afternoon in 1997 with a knife is still, somewhere, in the world. And Kate Bushell is still, somewhere, in the memory of everyone who has ever heard this story, in the minds of investigators who have spent careers on her case, in the heart of a brother who marks every November, in the imagination of anyone who has ever turned a corner on a familiar lane and thought, for just a moment, about how safe the ordinary feels. About how much of daily life depends on the assumption of safety. About how little it takes to break that assumption and how long it takes to rebuild. She was 14. She finished her homework. She bought her brother a birthday present he never got to receive from her hands. She walked a neighbor's dog along a lane she knew. The question that remains, the question that has remained for 28 years, and that nobody has yet answered, is very simple, and very specific. Who was there? If you've carried this story this far, if you feel its weight the way it deserves to be felt, then sit with it for a moment. The Kate Bushell case is still open. If you know anything, no matter how small it seems, Devon and Cornwall Police can be reached through their major incident public portal. Crime Stoppers can be reached anonymously at 0800 555 111. The reward of £20,000 remains in place. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you in the way that matters, please subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and share this with someone who needs to hear Kate's name. These cases stay unsolved, in part, because not enough people know they exist. You can change that. Kate Bushell. 14 years old. Exwick, Devon. November 15, 1997. Still waiting for an answer.